Dario mentioned, I think there's a lot of relations that can be drawn, even the area of research is obviously very different in terms of different aspects, but I find it interesting that Dario sort of engaged with the idea of decomposition, basically, of living matter, and that Gillian is actually addressing the decomposition of art or stuff, or art stuff, basically, or the stuff of art. So, but I was curious in that regard, and relating to the greater issues of this year's conference, how would you, so I'm starting off with my own question here, but obviously it's up to you guys afterwards to pursue the task. Because there's a lot of, even Michael jumped on the mushroom design, and that's just really interesting. The print design on the paper, which is really interesting and stuff. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but I was wondering how would you actually relate your research or work in relation to, well, maybe generally the theme of the conference, which is constellation, clusters, and networks, but otherwise more specifically maybe networks in general or different approaches to networks.
Okay, business. Relationship to the conference. I think it's, for me, it fits in all three subcategories, kind of in reverse order. So in most applicable would be the network, followed by the cluster, followed by the constellation. Just as a very symbolic way of the way mycelium works and the way mushrooms work, not only their function in the ecosystem, but also in a more symbolic level. So the network I talked about pretty thoroughly here. I mean, obviously do more, but the cluster I think is an interesting second layer, which is the way that the fruiting body actually erupts. So we all talk about mushrooms and we think about the cap and stem model, because that's what we see. But the organism is below ground. So that is the organism, and the mushroom is the fruit. Think like apple tree. Like the tree is the organism, but the apple is just the fruit. It's the same idea, but because we don't see it, we kind of assume the mushroom is the organism like a plant, but it's not. So, but when we do see it, it means there's a cluster of energy, that the mycelium has thickened in that area and decided it's worth sprouting fruit. And this is for numerous reasons that I won't get into, but I think that second layer of the conference, the thinking about clusters and how that relates to mushrooms, has its own trajectory that I'd like to explore.
I think mine also similarly relates to all three of the words that make up the conference. Constellations I imagine as sort of like smaller contained units of multiples. So the idea of an object moving between people in a sort of constellation, and then it sort of manifests as a visible cluster, like when the trash washes up on the shore, and then also the Orozco's intervention with creating these new clusters, and how that relates to the wider network of everything, and how all of these constellations are connecting to each other via the classification through clusters.
Thanks. Other questions?
I have maybe like a follow-up question. I really love this. What a good start to the day. And I mean, probably should have been placed before Work's keynote last night, right? And this interlacing of culture and society. Culture and nature that he's talking about, and the Anthropocene. Probably my question's for you, Gillian. Kind of half-baked, but I think that what all of the artists that you guys showed us are doing they are tapping into these material networks that are already existing, right? As opposed to creating something new. Gillian, you said something eloquently about how these objects are not maps, but they are the things themselves. And then you described how then the circulation of these objects cut across all of these borders, national and so on. But I wonder if you could speak about the way that Roscoe is creating a network. In other words, maybe what is the kind of selection process that he goes through? Is this everything that washes up on the beach? Or what can we say about his stylistic choices in displays, the kind of taxonomy of ordering these things?
Yeah. So he basically is kind of known for wandering and picking things up everywhere. And the reason he started going, or he went to the coastal biosphere for another project that he did where he retrieved a huge whale skeleton and took all the pieces and then put it back together, and that was on display. And I think when he was there doing that project, he saw everything else that had washed up. And it's in a certain space where the tides kind of just bring so much to that one particular place. So there's a lot of stuff that's washed up there. And then as far as the park on the Hudson, he is a fan of boomerang throwing for sport. So he would go there and find other types of debris, but you know, they were all from human existence and life. But in a way, so were the ones from the coastal biosphere. So I think that his selection when he's picking things up is rather obsessive and inexhaustive. I think he takes everything. And I don't think that anything gets excluded ever. In the installation he had, you know, the bigger items all the way down to these tiny little fragments of a bowl or ceramics or a tiny piece of stone or anything like that. So yeah, I think it's just kind of an exhaustive process. And then just to jump off that, I thought what was interesting is that he doesn't really distinguish between what's, or at least for sand stars, the things that are man-made or that are natural, and he sort of treats them on the same level. Like I said in the paper, there's, once things enter debris, there's no real hierarchy. And so I kind of felt like that connected with yours, where the mushroom is kind of eating the pavement and coming out of it. But with Orozco, he's looking at things that are all on the same plane, instead of differentiating between like nature taking over a man-made material. Although it's impossible to look at the work as not being a comment on this sort of like environmental crisis and the ecology of, you know, all this trash, which is sort of like the post-mortem responsibility of what's happening. And I think that the sheer number of the things that he collects is sort of emphasizing that point too. Does that answer your question?
He's got this littering quality, where he's like a professional litter picker-upper.
Yeah.
Question in the back.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about what is the networks. What do you mean by networks? Is a mushroom you're saying the organism is the underground and the fruit is up. So how does it like networks with the rest of the environment? And if it's like if you compare it with other organism like for example like leek, which has also a stem, but is it also comparable to that kind of network?
I think if I understand your question well, I think what it comes down to is the reason why mushrooms have their own kingdom. So we think of like animals as being a kingdom, plants as being a kingdom, and fungi as being a completely separate kingdom. So It differs from a leek because the leek is the organism. So its roots and the plant and everything, even the tiniest roots that extend off, as you pull it out, and if you were to scoop out all the roots, you would take the entire organism with you. And so the mushroom is living in soil and existing on the nutrients that are basically inaccessible to anything else. So it's able to digest rocks and pull and separate the nutrients and get minerals and potassium and things out of those rocks. So it functions in a very different way than any other plant. And that's what kind of separates it into its own kingdom. And in terms of the way it networks, it does so basically by filling a niche. So by opening the potential for nutrients from rocks or things that plants cannot access, it also makes them available to the plants that are nearby. So it is mediating the nutrients that are in any given plot of land, not only for its own purpose, but to help anything that's around it. So that's kind of the decompositional quality. And then the former, which I just briefly talked about because it's its own topic, and it is kind of, in a lot of ways, where my interest lies more so, is that symbiotic relationship. And that is a unique to mushroom phenomena, where it actually fuses with roots of various plants, I mean, vascular plants of all sorts. Orchids, for instance, oftentimes cannot even germinate without a mushroom partner. So in that way, it's networking by transferring nutrients where they need to be, kind of being the extra reach for the ground, and for any of the trees or any of the organisms that need more nutrients, it can make those available for itself and anything surrounding it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Others? Thoughts?
This is really interesting. It actually introduces another perspective into looking at networks, because I'm thinking certainly this idea, the notion, the ethos of networking in today's society, right, has spawned off another profession, if you will, which is connecting. Because it's not just to initiate the meeting or the relationship, right? It's to actually be a connector and be connecting several different specimens as a different way of thinking of what networking could be about. But so thank you for that. So I have a question. Well, that's related for both, and it's also half-baked in the morning. But thank you for your paper. So absolutely, I agree totally with Mikhail that this resonates so much with our keynote talk from last night, and really thinking about the Anthropocene and this moment, you know. And so I appreciate that very much. And I sort of wanted to link my question for both of you within the realm of some of the concerns that came up last night, which is about climate change. Euphemism, a nicer word for global warming and all our ecological, environmental disasters that we're creating for ourselves. And so I'm wondering how, when we're talking about debris, but then we're also talking about the emancipatory or productive ways of thinking of decomposition, right? This idea. I'm sort of led to think about, okay, one of the concerns about this huge amount of garbage we have is that hopefully a lot of it is biodegradable, right? So one of the things I'm thinking is how, for example, Dario, the study of mushrooms is going to be part of that project. And how that might mitigate some of the disastrous things that are happening in our, not just our coastal biospheres, but deep into our international ocean, zones of oceans, where, Gillian, we can find in contrast to Orozco's work, where he's accumulating things that he finds that are washed up, that are almost incidental, this is in such contrast to those deliberate deposits of debris, which are called landfills, right? Which are discreetly somehow trucked away or containered away and dropped into the middle of the ocean so we don't see it. And I'm just wondering if in terms of the networks of the movement of all these debris that you're thinking through, if that comes up in your study.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that Orozco's point, whether it's intentional or not, is to comment on the sheer size of, or just the sheer number of items of trash that are in the ocean. And in the catalog for the exhibition, Nancy Spector talks about something that I think a lot of people know about, which is like a trash island that's in the middle of the ocean, although I think that I've read some articles where they dispute that and say that it's not actually like a solid structure, it's more just like a lot of things floating in one sort of like circular tide movement that you can see. And in his in the objects that he collected, some of the bottles had notes in them that people had, or I think scientists had put in to track. The notes said where the source point for the bottle was put into the ocean so that they can track the tides and the systems. And I think that, yeah, it's mostly about the sheer number of things that are in the ocean, and that it's kind of never ending. It's just this never ending thing that's going in. And though that things do erode, you know, the styrofoam and the buoys and everything that's lost in the light bulbs, they can get broken down, but they're still there, and it's never actually going away. And I'm sure that he could go again, you know, this was a project that he started in 2011 onto 2012, but I'm sure that if he went back again, he could have the same amount of things just in that one small, tiny piece of the coastline. But listening to Dario's paper, I got to thinking about this too, and how, you know, mushrooms can be used as a sense of decomposition, and the idea of like a byproduct, you know, like humans create, or they use all these things, and then it becomes a byproduct, and it's in the ocean, and then Orozco takes it out and enters it into the realm of, you know, art commodity, which I think is an important way to expose certain, you know, things about the environment, which it seems like J. Rimley is also doing. But I wondered what, you know, how are people using these decomposition suits now? You know, that seems like a big problem that I had never heard about, you know, like decomposing bodies. You never think about that. There's so many people buried in the world, and where is all that going, you know? So is that the reception of that process welcome in the dialogue of global warming?
Yeah, I'll try to kind of answer both. I see J. Rimley's work at this point more as a conceptual calling, kind of an invitation to think about these ideas, right? Like, consider our bodies as toxic items. But it's pretty well known in, like, for people who are looking into people in like the post-mortem reality, that it's extremely toxic in the environment. I was just reading a stat, and I can't remember the numbers, but in the several hundred thousands of gallons of formaldehyde being buried every year, because that's the embalming fluid that we use right now, you know, in like kind of more the really traditional burial practices where you're covered in makeup and you have this formaldehyde replacing all of your blood, and then you bury that in the ground, and it doesn't even decompose, it just rots. So it's like completely counterintuitive. So as far as I know, it's not being practiced right now, but there is a system that you can donate your body to her project, and there's like lots of volunteers who have donated their corpse to be eaten by mushrooms. So in that sense, it's kind of introductory, but as far as I know, it's not really in like practice as we speak. Let's see, so in terms of the global warming, it's got huge ramifications, huge potential, but I think what I want to just say is that mushrooms thrive on disturbance, and they're unique in this way. You can follow mushroom development right up through where humans develop. Like even in the forest, you think like, oh, let's go to the darkest, most unknown forest to hunt for mushrooms. It's not really true. There's often more mushrooms along the path. And this is not an accident. They like disturbance. They like to be, the fruiting bodies, they fruit when they're worried. If everything is crystal clear and perfect, they stay underground. And they just function underground. So when we see the mushrooms fruiting, it means they're disturbed. So for a mushroom hunter, that's a good thing because we're surrounded by a world that's being disturbed by humans. And as far as the ecosystem, it has other ramifications. But the process of mycoremediation, which is the way that the mushrooms can break down toxins into elements that are safe for the environment, that happens only through the fruiting of the mushroom. They're eating and then releasing. They're basically using that energy, breaking apart those hydrocarbons to create energy to fruit bodies. So it is used in, I mentioned the kind of list, the laundry list of ways it's being used, and each one has its own paper that deserves to be talked about. But in terms of filtering water, that's a huge one. That is pretty well practiced. I did a project in Bellingham for Whatcom Creek, which is has long river heads way up high in the mountains, but it's like one of the last areas before it goes into the Bellingham Bay out of the Pacific Ocean. And me, and along with several other students, did a mycoremediation project where we put these burlap sacks filled with rye grain inoculated with oyster mushrooms. And we would basically build a dam, but it's porous, so it doesn't block the water, but it filters the water. And as the water comes through, these bags take in the water and digest the problematic things. Mushrooms like the problems. They like to nourish themselves with oil. Like that's a very easily accessible food for them. They can break down they break down everything. So it's really about intentionality. It's about how can we apply the function, because they're slow. Like they're not gonna follow their way into the city where the most pollution is being done. They're not gonna grow out into the ocean. Like they're not aquatic. There are some aquatic fungi, but they don't, they're terrestrial. But we can take them and make islands to put into oil spills that will then break down the oil that's floating on the surface of the ocean. And it's being used for that. So there is an application that's already being used, and there's way more potential. And it's one of these very intuitive models. And I think probably the people who were experimenting at the beginning, Paul Stamets is one of the earliest people who have kind of looked into mycoremediation. He's got lots of literature on it. These people are emulating the forest ecology. They're looking at the forest and going, oh wow, look how well this decomposes. Can we decompose our trash? And the answer for the most part is yes. They're very hungry species.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I don't know how much you know about this, but just listening. I wonder if mushrooms have evolved to take on this ability to process man-made toxins. Like, because I'm sure that the early mushrooms were only decomposing natural things, right?
Well, they've always had the role of pulling nutrients where other animals and plants can't reach them. Mm-hmm. So they are breaking down rocks as well. And I think I've read there's definitely some speculation about the coevolution with humans, because they are significantly faster than plants. If we compare, mushroom will go from nothing to full fruit overnight in the right conditions. So they are very, very fast. I don't know if that helps your answer. It's the emerging discipline, and so there's no
Right, yeah.
conclusions about
Yeah,
that
I know.
evolution, but it's certainly a possibility.